Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Natalie. I am the artist and owner of NMC Design Studio, a small art business based out of Seattle, Washington. Today we're going to be talking about the difference in softwares. This is probably a very specific niche because I'm specifically going to be talking about vector softwares, comparing Adobe Illustrator to Affinity Designer. So totally understandable if this is not relevant to you as an artist, because I know not all artists use vector art programs. I'll actually start with talking about what vector art actually is, in case you're not aware and you still want to watch this video. Thank you. So in images and like digital projections of images, there are two types. So we have vector and we have raster. So raster is any image or artwork or anything that has pixels. When you enlarge or shrink a raster image, those pixels also grow and shrink. So that's how you get pixelated looking images, because the pixels per inch aren't enough to support whatever size the image is at. Vector images, on the other hand, don't have pixels at all. So their curves and shapes are all calculated mathematically, and you can enlarge or shrink however much you want, and you won't get a pixelated image because there aren't any pixels, because everything's calculated with numbers or something. I'm not exactly sure of the science behind it, but the basic idea behind raster versus vector is vector images have pixels. You'll get a lot more like gradients and things like that, a lot more like dynamic coloring, I guess you could say. Whereas vector is going to be a lot more flat colors and shapes, but you won't have pixels, so you don't need to worry about how you're sizing or resizing a vector image. Another way you can think about it is Photoshop as well as Procreate work with raster images. If you've ever zoomed in really far on a Procreate canvas and you have like a color, you can see the pixels in that, whereas Adobe Illustrator works in vector images. So we're going to be talking specifically about vector art software. So we're going to be contrasting Adobe Illustrator and Affinity Designer. And previously I used Adobe Illustrator for pretty much all of my vector artwork. Any of my digital art that you see, except for my Asia Juice print, is vector art. Asia Juice was done in Procreate, and that was a learning experience all on its own, because having previously worked in vector for pretty much everything I do digitally, I'm so not used to having to like actually draw to the scale that I want it to be at, because in vector I can just resize it freely and I don't need to worry about that. I swapped from Adobe Illustrator to Affinity Designer for a few reasons that we'll get into, but I did this swap like last year, like fully a year ago. And I took a lot of notes during that time of like, what's different? What do you need to adjust if you're also thinking of swapping from Illustrator to Affinity Designer? So I have all those notes, and then I also took a look at the price differences and things like that. So we'll actually start there. We're gonna start looking at the prices. So one of the big motivations for me swapping was price, as well as Adobe's kind of foray into artificial intelligence stuff, but one of the big things was price. So Affinity products, they have three. They have Affinity Designer, which is essentially a Adobe Illustrator dupe. They have Affinity Photo, which is essentially a Adobe Photoshop, or maybe it's more closely related to Lightroom dupe. I haven't actually used Affinity Photo, even though I have access to it, so I can't exactly tell you if it's more leaning towards like what you would expect with Photoshop versus more leaning towards what you would expect with like a Lightroom. And then they also have Affinity Publisher, which is a dupe for Adobe InDesign. And you can buy any of these products individually. So for purchasing just Affinity Designer for one operating system, they have separate prices for Mac, Windows, and iPad. iPad is a lot cheaper, but I didn't include it in this. But the price for buying it for Mac or Windows is $69.99, and that is without any sales or anything. That's just the default pricing. The price for the Affinity Universal license is $165.99, and so that will get you all three of the Affinity products across all operating systems, and that's what I got. but I actually got it for 50% off when a bunch of stuff was happening with Adobe and a lot of people were looking to jump ship. So Affinity capitalized on that and was like, hey, come over and we'll give you it for cheaper. So I think I got it for 50% off. And it was like $79.99 or like $80, something close to that. The big difference here though is these are one-time payments. They're not like a monthly subscription. You don't have to keep paying them. It's one-time payment and you have the software forever, which is so nice. And I didn't use Adobe products when they were having the same like payment schema of buy it once and have it forever. I came into Adobe while they were having the Creative Cloud license and it's like a monthly recurring payment. So it was really nice to switch over to just buying it and being done with paying money. But speaking of, if we're compare contrasting, we'll talk about Adobe's pricing as well. So monthly for just Illustrator is $22.99. So you're gonna pay $22.99 every month that you're wanting access to continue to use Adobe Illustrator. Or if you wanted access to all of the Adobe programs, so their Creative Cloud license, it would be $69.99 monthly or $41.99 if you opt in for their annual plan, but you're still paying monthly. So obviously both those prices are cheaper than the Affinity price tag, but you have to remember that you're going to be paying these monthly. So just for some more comparing and contrasting, if you're planning on having just the designer / Illustrator dupe for 4 months or more, it is worth it, money-wise, price-wise, to have Affinity Designer. It'll pay itself off and be cheaper at that point than it would be to have a Adobe Illustrator subscription for that amount of time. Similarly, if you were to get the universal license for Affinity and get all 3 of those products, as well as the ability to put it on whatever operating system you want, that is worth it if you are planning on having those programs for 4 months or more as well. And that is specifically compared to the annual monthly price for Creative Cloud license. If you were to do the month-to-month Creative Cloud license, it would be worth it to get the Affinity Universal license for 3 months or more. I will note though that with the Creative Cloud license from Adobe, you get a lot more stuff. Adobe just has more products for you to use. And I think the one thing that I really miss from my Adobe Creative Cloud license was their font library with any Adobe license. So it could be the individual Illustrator or the Creative Cloud. You get access to their Adobe fonts library. That is huge and also really nice. So as someone who does use fonts fairly frequently in my work, I do really miss having access to all of those fonts for my use. And something that hasn't really affected me yet, but is something else that you lose out on, is Adobe has cloud storage for, free. It's included in any of their products that you buy or monthly subscriptions that you buy, is that you get cloud storage. And Affinity does not have that. So that's something that I guess I kind of miss, like the ease, and I definitely am gonna have it affect me in the future when I have to go through and clean out all of my files on my computer, but it hasn't affected me yet, so I haven't really thought about it. And I think the only like program that I really used previously that I'm like, oh, I wish I still had access to it, is Adobe Acrobat, because you get that with the Creative Cloud license because it's an Adobe product and you get all of their Adobe products. But all of that to say, overall, I do not regret moving to Affinity rather than staying with Adobe. It's definitely helped monetarily, and I feel like the features that I use on like a daily or weekly basis are very comparable. So now on to some notes and thoughts about actually transitioning from Illustrator to Affinity Designer. The first one is importing files. So Affinity Designer allows you to import Adobe Illustrator files, and it works fairly well. However, one thing that I do when I work is I don't stay within like a canvas or an artboard. I will often just put things everywhere in my file. And when you import a Illustrator file into Affinity Designer, it only takes into account anything that is actually in an artboard. So while I was working on importing things, I was like, oh, okay, I need to go make a bunch of artboards in my Illustrator files so that I can capture all of this extra work that's like outside of my artboards. I believe the Affinity Designer background is not default like dark gray, like Adobe Illustrator's is, but you can go in and change it. And I had to kind of search for the setting, but it's in settings under UI. And you can change it to whatever color you want. I just chose dark gray because I'm very used to Adobe Illustrator. Another change from Illustrator to Affinity Designer is that layers aren't like global, I guess. They're kind of per artboard in Affinity Designer. And if I'm remembering correctly, again, the last time I used Illustrator was a year ago, if not more. Illustrator's layers were just one set of layers for the entire document. Affinity Designer separates it out by artboards. So artboard 1 is going to have a set of layers, and artboard 2 is going to have a set of layers, and those layers only contain items that are in that artboard's bounds. So not something that like I'm upset with, but is something to note. And there are also some differences with controls. So I'll be honest, after using Affinity Designer for over a year now, I fully forgot that this was a thing. So I'm glad I wrote down my thoughts and notes when I originally switched over. So I use these programs on Windows. I'll just make that caveat. And the controls to zoom are different in Affinity Designer than they are in Adobe Illustrator. So in Adobe Illustrator, you click on Alt to zoom with scroll wheel, or hold Alt to zoom with scroll wheel. In Affinity Designer, you hold Control to zoom with the scroll wheel. Another difference in the control schema is that when clicking and dragging to select items, you have to highlight the entire object in order to actually select it. So like, let's say I have a circle and I click and drag and I only hit like this part of the circle or this side, it won't select the object in Affinity Designer. Whereas in Adobe Illustrator, it would have selected that object. So in order to select an object in Affinity Designer with that clicking and dragging, you have to like click and drag over the entire object. And then I'll be honest, even after a year of using Affinity Designer, I still am not 100% sure how their like swapping to last used tool really works. I think it's Control when I'm actually using the tool I know, so maybe I'll check and insert a little text blurb here to let you know what it actually is. But it only seems to function with like some, or maybe it's Alt that goes to last used. Anyways, I'll insert here what it actually is because my fingers know what it is and my brain does not. Moving on to shapes and lines, which is the things that I use the most often. The pen tool. So one of the things in Adobe Illustrator is the pen tool. When you click and create I think they'd be called like vertices or vertexes, you can like see a preview of where your cursor is and what the line will look like. That isn't on in default in Affinity Designer, which is annoying. And I have beef with the creators of Affinity Designer for this specifically, but there is an option to turn it on. So there's like a little modes up in the top toolbar, and there's one button in specific that has like a little wiggly line with a circle on the end to indicate one of the vertexes. And you click on that and that toggles the mode where you can see that preview of what the line will look like. The other annoying thing with this though, which again, beef with the developers, it doesn't stay toggled on from what I can tell and from how I've used it. I think it will stay on in a file within the same like app session, if you want to call it that. So if you close the whole program down and then reopen it, that option has been reset essentially, and you'll have to go in and re-enable it. Also, if you open up a new file, that setting won't be turned on. So it's not like an account setting, it's like a per file, per session setting, kind of, something or other. Anyways, I click that button a lot because I like having that on. One of the positives for Affinity Designer is that when you're using the white cursor to adjust like specific angles and points and things on a line or a shape, and you are having it snap to something, Affinity Designer actually like annotates on top of your file what it's snapping to, so you can see the angles and stuff. Whereas if I remember correctly, Illustrator didn't really do that. So that's something that's really useful. So if you're like, why is this point snapping to this specific spot? I don't understand. I don't want it to snap there. You can see why it's snapping there. Like, oh, maybe it's a 45-degree angle to this other point that's over here. Just like useful information to have. There's also a little bit of a different like divide, merge, subtract behavior in Affinity Designer. Specifically in the sense that if you have like a circle on top of another circle, so you have a large circle and then you have a smaller circle in that, clicking divide when you have those two shapes selected isn't going to do anything for you. And this does make sense. I'm just used to Illustrator would just allow you to divide those and now have two separate shapes, one that looks more like a donut and one that's a circle still. But it does make sense because there are different ways to go about doing what you're trying to do. Either if you want a hole in the middle of one of the shapes, you use the, I think, subtract function, where essentially where it's overlapping, you delete any overlapping portion. Or if you wanted color there, you already have the item there and it's just on top. It is a little bit annoying when I'm like, I want just like one layer of thing, and then I have to like create a copy of that circle in the middle and then divide one of those copies and then leave the other copy so that, you know, there's color in the middle. But there are workarounds and I've gotten used to doing that. So, you know, just like an adjustment at the outset. One other different thing is there's no clipping mask action in Affinity Designer. Essentially what you will do to create a clipping mask is you'll make whatever shape you want, and then in the layers panel, you'll drag whatever item you want to be clipped into the object that is doing the clipping or is doing the masking, and that creates a clipping mask. So there's no like action in objects or whatnot that says clipping mask like it does in Illustrator. In terms of shapes for Affinity Designer, it actually has such a larger library of shapes, like default shapes, than Illustrator did, or at least that I had found in Illustrator. I'm sure there was probably a way to get more shapes, but by default, Affinity Designer has so many more shapes, which is great. I love it. Next thing is colors. So there's one thing in the color section that I do really miss from Illustrator, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, the positives. If you work a lot with Pantone colors, which I do not at this point, I haven't really done much embroidery or many like enamel pins, which I think you use Pantone colors a lot for that. And I know Illustrator used to have the Pantone color library, but from my understanding, it got taken out. But Affinity Designer does have a Pantone color library built into their color palettes. So very nice to use if that is something that you need in your workflows. So the one thing that I really miss from Illustrator is their freeform gradients. It was one of their gradient tools, and I mean, it is what it sounds like. Essentially, you could click a little, put a point on a shape and say, this is the color I want this point to be, this is the color I want this other point to be, and then this other point over here. And these points weren't connected, they just had to live somewhere within the shape. If you chose different colors, it would make a gradient between it. Freeform gradient. There isn't something like that in Affinity Designer, and that bums me out because I thought it was really nice, and it was just a really nice tool as well. Like I mentioned before, it's harder to get like some of that like shading and color variation and stuff like that in vector art because everything's mathematical and it's harder to do that. So having access to that freeform gradient was really nice, and I miss it. The workaround is not the greatest, at least the workaround that I found, is you just get some shapes like circles or ovals and you put a color and have it gradient out to fully transparent, and then you'll just layer those on top of each other. It means that the colors end up being a little less vibrant because you're not like directly mixing the colors, you're putting them on top of one another, so it affects how the colors look. And it can take a bit of finagling to like get it to look exactly right. So if you've paid attention to my branding at all, I have like a freeform gradient that I use a lot in some of my more like text heavy posts on social media, and a lot of my banners and stuff have that like red, green, and orangey yellow gradient. And if you look really closely, you can see that there's a difference between some items, like my freebie just logo stickers that are on that gradient background versus some of my social media like banners. And this is because I made those freebie thank you stickers back when I still had and was using Adobe Illustrator. And I've made a lot of my new social media banners in the time between that when I've been using Affinity Designer. And like I said before, Affinity Designer functions differently. So you can tell a little bit of the difference in like color vibrancy because it doesn't have that layering effect on those thank you freebie stickers versus the social media banners. The other thing that I miss, but I don't miss it nearly as much, is Illustrator had a really neat color suggestion window or like option that you could look at when you had a color selected. And this was really helpful when developing color palettes for either a single piece or like a collection of pieces that I wanted to be somewhat cohesive. Affinity Designer, to my knowledge, I don't think I've done a ton of investigation into if it exists, but I don't think it exists. It's at the very least not like a default thing that you see when you open up the program. So that is something else that if you do depend on that a lot, like I was previously, again, there's workarounds. I've just started pulling color palettes in from other places, a lot from Pinterest, and using those as kind of jumping off points and cohesive color schemes. And then final point for this kind of overview of the differences, exporting files. So this is the thing that I have had the biggest issue with, is exporting my files and sharing them with others. Previously, it was a lot easier because Adobe Illustrator is industry standard. So anyone that is going to take like Photoshop files will probably also take Adobe Illustrator files and can open those in some way. Affinity Designer files are Affinity Designer files, and you can't export them as Adobe Illustrator files. So I have had a year of struggle of figuring out what the best file format is to share with manufacturers and other folks for Affinity Designer. And I've gone through a couple. So PNGs obviously will get the job done. They're just transparent raster image file types like JPEGs, but a little bit different. I'll be honest, don't fully know the difference other than the fact that PNGs can be transparent, and I don't think JPEGs can. So this is useful if you have no other option and transparency is really important in your art piece or whatever you're working on. I've defaulted to it a couple times just because I was like, I can't get anything else to work, have a PNG. Again, like we talked about at the beginning though, you just have to remember that PNGs are a raster image file, so you lose the vector image properties, and you just need to make sure that you are exporting it at a high enough size that pixelation isn't going to be an issue. And then I've also tried exporting as .eps files, .svg files, and PDF files. And I've had mixed results with these. For some reason, couldn't tell you why. Most of these file types, it seems like any transparency. So like if I had, like I was talking before with the gradient, the freeform gradients, if I have a gradient that goes to transparency, it isn't maintained or preserved when I export to those other file types. I don't know why. It's annoying. And it ends up just being like a solid color and is not what I want, which is often why I have ended up defaulting to PNG files, because I know that that transparency will be preserved. Another thing with the .eps, .svg, and PDF files is I don't believe layers and grouping are preserved either in those. So if you make your layers really nice in your Affinity Designer file and then export it, I don't think those layers are always going to be the same, which is also unfortunate. So far, that specifically has not really bitten me in the butt yet, hopefully, but it is just something to, I guess, note. And then you also are able to export to Photoshop files. I'll be honest, I don't really know what this looks like on the exported file end, but I've also had mixed results. Specifically, I exported to Photoshop files for printing some risograph prints. They requested to have Photoshop files, so I saw that that was an option within Affinity Designer. I did it. It worked well for one of them and then didn't work for the other file that I sent, because I had sent 2 files. For some reason, I couldn't tell you why, because on my end it looked totally fine. I will say with that, I believe it preserves the layers and the grouping, and it seems like it preserves the transparency as well, which is good because we like transparency and it's staying transparent when it needs to be. So going forward, I might try exporting more of my manufacturing files through Photoshop and sending those that way, and kind of using the proofs to validate if it's working or not. But those are all of the differences between Affinity Designer and Adobe Illustrator that I have for you today. But overall, as someone who uses Affinity Designer for everything that I do digitally, art-wise, I would highly recommend it. I think the price tag alone is like, it's so much cheaper. Like, oh my goodness, so much cheaper. And I don't think I was even paying like the full price for Creative Cloud. I think I was still paying the student price. So it was like $32 every month, and that's still so much. I would highly recommend it. It definitely gets the job done. It's missing a few features that are like more nice to have, but it has all of the core features that you really need. And again, the biggest issue is that file transferring, but I feel like there are ways to work around it and to kind of get through that. Other than that, it's just kind of like a learning curve to get acquainted with this new software that is very similar but does have a few differences, and figuring out what those differences are and how to make the software work for you. But that is it for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my Ko-fi subscribers for supporting me. But you can also support me on Ko-fi for either $1 or $3 a month. At the $1 level, you get access to monthly sketchbooks, behind the scenes content. Also, you get your name in this video. For $3, that's how you get the digital backgrounds every month for desktop and mobile. And if you enjoyed this video, I would love if you subscribed. I post videos every Monday about my artwork and running a small art business and what that's like. I will see y'all in the next one. Bye.